Somewhere in the warm waters of the Caribbean, around the year 1716, a boy no older than 11 was dragged from a captured merchant vessel and thrown onto the deck of a pirate sloop. He had no shoes. He had no family left aboard. The ship he had been traveling on was already sinking behind him, black smoke curling into a sky so blue it almost looked fake. A man with a pistol tucked into a sash pointed at a bucket and a mop, and that was the boy's introduction to his new life. No ceremony, no explanation, just a bucket, a mop, and the understanding that if he didn't start scrubbing, he'd be swimming. Now imagine that scene on a map. Picture the coastline of Jamaica stretching out to the south. Trace the shipping lanes that curled through the windward passage between Cuba and Hispaniola, routes absolutely crawling with merchant traffic hauling sugar, rum, tobacco, and enslaved people. Then picture the dozens of tiny islands scattered through the Bahamas, places like Nassau and New Providence, which by the early 1700s had become pirate cities. This was the Golden Age of Piracy, and if you could zoom in on any one of those trade routes on any given week, you would find children aboard almost every ship. Not passengers, workers. Some of them volunteers, many of them not. And the youngest among them, the ones at the absolute bottom of the shipboard hierarchy, were called cabin boys. Now pull back on that map even further. Follow the trade winds east across the Atlantic to the coast of West Africa, where pirate hunters like Bartholomew Roberts prowled the shipping lanes between Cape Verde and the Gold Coast. Then north to the waters off Newfoundland, where pirates intercepted fishing fleets heading back to Europe loaded with cod and furs. Then south, around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, where the Malabar coast offered targets so rich that a single prize could set a crew up for life. Everywhere you look on this map, everywhere trade moved and money flowed, pirates followed. And everywhere pirates sailed, cabin boys sailed with them. This is what life was actually like for the youngest person on a pirate ship, and almost none of it matches what you've seen in the movies. To understand the cabin boy, you first need to understand what the world looked like for children in the 1600s and 1700s. Childhood, the way we think of it today, with school and protection and the idea that kids deserve to just be kids, that concept basically did not exist. A boy of 7 or 8 was considered old enough to work. In port cities like Bristol, London, Liverpool, and later Kingston and Charleston, boys from poor families were regularly sent to sea. Sometimes their parents arranged it. Sometimes the boys were orphans, and the local parish shipped them off because feeding them was too expensive. And sometimes a boy simply wandered too close to the docks, and a press gang grabbed him. The age range was staggering by modern standards. Cabin boys, as young as 7, have been documented aboard Royal Navy ships. On pirate vessels, the ages tended to skew slightly older, usually 9 to 14. But younger boys were not unheard of. The famous pirate Bartholomew Roberts captured a ship in 1721 that had a cabin boy aboard who was reportedly 8 years old. Roberts kept him, not out of cruelty necessarily, but because a small, quick boy who could squeeze into tight spaces and follow orders was genuinely useful on a working ship. And that is the first thing you need to know about the cabin boy's life. He was not a mascot. He was not a pet. He was labor. The duties of a cabin boy started before sunrise and did not end until the ship went quiet at night. His primary job was serving the captain or the ship's officers. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. That meant bringing food and drink to the captain's cabin, clearing plates, keeping the cabin clean, polishing weapons, maintaining the captain's wardrobe if he had one, and essentially acting as a personal servant. But that was only the beginning. When he wasn't attending to the captain, the cabin boy was expected to work alongside the regular crew. He hauled ropes. He scrubbed decks on his hands and knees with blocks of sandstone called holy stones, a job that would tear the skin off a grown man's palms, let alone a child's. He carried powder to the guns during battle. He climbed the rigging to help furl and unfurl sails, sometimes 100 feet above the deck on ropes that were wet and slick with salt spray. One of the most common jobs assigned to cabin boys was turning the sand glass. Ships kept time using half-hour sand glasses, and someone had to flip them the moment the sand ran out. This was the cabin boy's job. Every 30 minutes, day and night, he would turn the glass and ring the ship's bell. 8 turns of the glass made a 4-hour watch. If he fell asleep and missed a turn, the entire ship's schedule would drift. If he missed it twice, he'd be beaten. It sounds like a simple job, flipping a glass, but imagine doing it every 30 minutes for an entire night. Alone on a dark deck, the ocean black around you, the ship groaning under your feet, knowing that if you dozed off even once, someone would take a rope end to your back in the morning. The rigging work deserves special mention because it was genuinely terrifying. A fully rigged sailing ship of this era had masts that rose 80 to 100 feet above the deck, with a web of ropes, shrouds, and ratlines stretching between them. Cabin boys were sent aloft in all weather conditions, including storms, to help manage the sails. They climbed barefoot because shoes slipped on wet rope. They worked on narrow foot ropes suspended beneath the yards, the horizontal spars that held the sails, leaning forward over nothing but open air and ocean, while wrestling with canvas that could weigh hundreds of pounds when soaked. A fall from the top of the mainmast was almost always fatal, and boys fell. They fell more often than experienced sailors because their hands were smaller, their grip weaker, and their judgment of wind and balance still developing. The sea did not care that they were children. Cabin boys were also responsible for the ship's animals. Many pirate ships carried livestock aboard, chickens for eggs, goats for milk, sometimes pigs that were being fattened for slaughter. The cabin boy fed them, cleaned up after them, and kept them from going overboard in rough seas. He was also expected to catch rats when the vermin population got out of control, which, on a wooden sailing ship, was essentially always. Some cabin boys became genuinely skilled rat catchers. It was one of the few jobs where being small was an actual advantage, since they could crawl into the bilges and storage spaces where the rats nested. Now, here is where things diverge between a cabin boy on a legitimate merchant vessel or a Royal Navy ship, and a cabin boy on a pirate ship. On a Navy ship or a merchant vessel, the hierarchy was rigid and legally enforced. The cabin boy was at the bottom, and everyone above him had the legal right to discipline him. Beatings were routine. Flogging was common. The captain's word was absolute law, and a cabin boy who talked back or disobeyed could be strapped to a grating and whipped in front of the entire crew as an example. On a pirate ship, the dynamic was different. Not necessarily kinder, but different. Most pirate crews operated under Articles of Agreement, essentially a ship's constitution that every crew member signed or marked before sailing. These articles laid out how plunder would be divided, how disputes would be settled, and what punishments applied for specific offenses. The fascinating thing is that many of these articles applied to everyone aboard, including the cabin boy. On several documented pirate ships, the cabin boy received a share of the plunder. It was usually a quarter share or a half share compared to a regular sailor's full share. But it was something. A cabin boy on a merchant vessel earned nothing. A cabin boy on a pirate ship might walk away from a single successful raid with more money than his father made in a year. But that money came with conditions, and the conditions tell you a lot about how pirate society actually worked. Consider the Articles of Captain George Lowther, active around 1721 to 1724. His articles specified that every man would receive one full share of all plunder, but boys and servants would receive a reduced share, typically a quarter or a half. A quarter share of a rich prize could still be substantial. When Bartholomew Roberts captured a Portuguese treasure ship in 1720, the haul was so enormous that even a quarter share would have amounted to several £100, a sum an English laborer might need 10 years to earn. The pirate ship was a democracy of adults, and the cabin boy existed at the edges of that democracy. He could not vote on where the ship sailed next. He could not challenge the captain. He could, however, be protected by the articles. If a crew member abused a cabin boy beyond what the articles permitted, the boy could, in theory, bring the complaint before the crew for judgment. Whether this actually happened in practice is debatable, but the framework existed, and that alone made a pirate ship a very different environment from the rigid, top-down cruelty of a Royal Navy vessel. That said, let's not romanticize this. The pirate ship was still a brutal place, and the cabin boy was still the most vulnerable person aboard. The food situation alone tells you everything you need to know about daily life at sea. The standard diet on a sailing ship in the early 1700s consisted of hardtack, which was a type of biscuit baked so dry and hard that sailors sometimes had to smash it with a belaying pin just to break it into edible pieces. Hardtack was often infested with weevils, small beetle larvae that bored into the biscuit and lived inside it. Experienced sailors learned to eat their hardtack in the dark so they wouldn't have to see what was crawling through it. The cabin boy did not get first pick of the food. He ate last, and he ate whatever was left. Beyond hardtack, the diet included salt pork or salt beef that had been packed in barrels of brine. This meat was so heavily preserved that it was often inedible without hours of soaking. Sailors called it salt horse and joked that it tasted like leather. There were dried peas, sometimes oatmeal, and when the ship was near land, whatever fruit or fresh provisions could be taken aboard. Water was stored in wooden casks and went stale within weeks, turning green and slimy. This is one of the reasons rum and beer were so prevalent on ships. They didn't spoil the way water did. And yes, cabin boys drank rum, diluted, usually, mixed with water in a concoction called grog. But they drank it because the alternative was water that could make you sick. Scurvy was the ever-present terror. Without fresh fruits and vegetables, the body's vitamin C stores would deplete within a few weeks. The first symptoms were fatigue and aching joints. Then the gums would swell and bleed. Teeth would loosen and fall out. Old wounds would reopen. In advanced cases, the bones themselves would become brittle. Scurvy killed more sailors in this era than combat, storms, and shipwrecks combined. Cabin boys, being smaller and already nutritionally stressed from the physical demands placed on them, were often among the first to show symptoms. Sleep was another luxury the cabin boy rarely enjoyed in full. The crew slept in shifts called watches, typically 4 hours on and 4 hours off. The cabin boy's schedule was even worse because he was expected to serve the captain outside of the regular watch rotation. If the captain wanted food at midnight, the cabin boy got up. If the captain needed his cabin cleaned before dawn, the cabin boy was there. Some cabin boys reported sleeping no more than 3 or 4 hours at a stretch, and rarely in a hammock. On crowded ships, the cabin boy slept wherever he could find space, sometimes on coiled ropes, sometimes wedged between barrels in the hold, sometimes on the bare deck itself. The sleeping quarters on a pirate ship were, to put it plainly, revolting. Below decks was a world of permanent dampness, stale air, and darkness. The bilge, the lowest point of the ship's hull where water collected, smelled like a sewer. Rats ran over sleeping men. Lice and fleas were constant companions. In tropical waters, the heat below decks could be suffocating, and in colder latitudes, the cold seeped through the hull like a living thing. There was no privacy. There was no personal space. 30 to 70 men lived, ate, slept, and fought in an area smaller than a modern apartment. And then there was the violence. Combat at sea was not like the swashbuckling choreography you see in films. It was close, chaotic, and horrifyingly loud. When a pirate ship ran down its prey, The first move was usually to fire a warning shot or raise the black flag, giving the target a chance to surrender. Many did. But when a ship chose to fight, or when two pirate crews clashed, the reality was a brutal close-quarters brawl. Cannons were fired at nearly point-blank range, sending shrapnel and splinters tearing through wood and flesh. Then the ships would grapple together, hooks and ropes locking them side by side, and the boarding party would leap across with cutlasses, pistols, and axes. The cabin boy's role in combat was usually as a powder monkey. He would run gunpowder charges from the magazine, the storage area deep in the ship's belly, up to the gun crews on deck. This was one of the most dangerous jobs on the ship. The magazine was surrounded by wet felt curtains to prevent stray sparks, and the powder monkey had to move fast, carrying cartridges of gunpowder through corridors that were already filling with smoke and noise. A single spark in the wrong place would ignite the powder and kill the boy instantly. During the battle itself, cannonballs and grapeshot turned the deck into a killing ground. Splinters from shattered wood were actually a bigger threat than the cannonballs themselves. A cannonball hitting a ship's rail could send a cloud of wooden shards, 6 inches long, flying through the air like daggers. Cabin boys who survived their first battle often carried the scars for life. There is one account from a pirate trial in 1722 where a former cabin boy, then in his 20s, described his first sea battle. He said the noise was the worst part, not the sight of blood or the screaming of wounded men, but the sound of the cannons, which he described as feeling like someone hitting him in the chest with a hammer, over and over until his ears rang for days afterward. He said he wet himself during the first broadside and was too terrified to feel ashamed about it. He said the deck was so slippery with blood and seawater that he fell twice while running powder charges, and the second time he fell, he landed on a man who was already dead. He was 13 when it happened. That kind of experience, repeated across months and years at sea, either broke a boy or forged him into something harder than the iron fittings on the ship. There was no middle ground. Not every cabin boy ended up on a pirate ship by force. Some actively sought it out. And to understand why a child would voluntarily join a pirate crew, you need to understand just how miserable the alternatives were. Life aboard a Royal Navy ship was, in many ways, worse than piracy. The pay was poor and often delayed by months or even years. The discipline was savage, with formal floggings that could lay a man's back open to the bone. Press gangs roamed port cities, kidnapping men and boys and forcing them into service. A cabin boy on a Navy ship had no share of prizes, no vote, no voice, and no way to leave until the Navy decided he could go. Compared to that, a pirate ship that offered a share of the loot, a say in how things were run, and the freedom to leave at the next port must have seemed like a reasonable trade. Dangerous, absolutely, but at least you had some control over your own fate. Some of the most famous pirates in history started as cabin boys. Edward Ned Lowe, one of the most violent pirates of the Golden Age, went to sea as a young boy and worked his way up from the very bottom. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew. But it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds, grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. His early experiences of cruelty and deprivation aboard legitimate vessels are thought to have shaped the extreme violence he later inflicted on his captives. Bartholomew Roberts, also known as Black Bart, one of the most successful pirates in history by sheer number of ships captured, was originally taken as a captive from a slave-trading ship. He started low, proved his competence, and rose to command a fleet that terrorized the Atlantic and the Caribbean. Francis Drake, arguably the most famous English sea captain of the Elizabethan age, went to sea as a boy and served what amounted to an apprenticeship aboard small trading vessels before working his way up to command the fleet that helped defeat the Spanish Armada. Henry Morgan, the legendary buccaneer who sacked Panama City and eventually became Lieutenant Governor of Jamaica, arrived in the Caribbean as a young indentured servant, which was functionally identical to being a cabin boy with even fewer rights. They did not start at the top. They started in the bilge. The path from cabin boy to pirate captain was not common, but it was possible, and that possibility is part of what made the pirate world so different from the legitimate naval world. In the Royal Navy, your birth largely determined how far you could rise. Officers came from wealthy families. Common sailors stayed common sailors. But on a pirate ship, ability mattered more than background. A cabin boy who proved he could navigate, who showed courage in a fight, who earned the respect of the crew, could eventually be elected to positions of authority. The pirate ship was, in a very real sense, one of the most meritocratic institutions of its time. Twisted, violent, and illegal, but meritocratic. Now we need to address the darker side of this story, because leaving it out would be dishonest. Cabin boys were vulnerable to exploitation and abuse in ways that went beyond the routine violence of shipboard life. Sexual abuse of cabin boys was a documented reality, though it was rarely discussed openly in the historical record. Court records from pirate trials occasionally reference these crimes, and naval regulations of the period included specific punishments for what they termed unnatural acts, which suggests the problem was widespread enough to require formal rules. On pirate ships, the Articles of Agreement sometimes included prohibitions against meddling with boys, which is a sanitized way of acknowledging that the threat was real and present. The isolation of the sea made these crimes easier to commit and harder to escape. A cabin boy hundreds of miles from land, surrounded by armed men, had no one to appeal to and nowhere to run. Some boys endured in silence. Some fought back and were punished for it. Some jumped overboard rather than continue. The ocean was not a romantic adventure for these children. It was a workplace without labor laws, without child protection, and without accountability. Disease was another constant companion. Beyond scurvy, ships were breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, yellow fever, and malaria. When a disease swept through a ship, the cabin boy, with his already depleted body and his constant exposure to the worst conditions aboard, was often among the first to fall ill and the last to receive any kind of treatment. Ship's surgeons, when they existed at all, were usually barely trained and working with tools that would horrify a modern observer. Amputations were performed with saws and no anesthesia beyond a leather strap to bite down on and a cup of rum. Wounds were treated with hot tar. Infections were treated with hope. Tropical diseases were particularly devastating. When a pirate ship sailed into the waters off West Africa or the Caribbean during the rainy season, malaria and yellow fever could sweep through the crew like fire through dry timber. Yellow fever, which sailors called the black vomit because of the dark blood victims, would retch up in the final stages, killed with terrifying speed. A man could feel fine at breakfast and be dead by sunset. Cabin boys, sleeping in the worst ventilated parts of the ship, bitten by mosquitoes more frequently because they worked the night watches and slept on exposed decks, were especially vulnerable. The mortality rate for young boys at sea in this period was staggering. Exact numbers are impossible to determine because cabin boys were not always recorded in ships' manifests. They existed in a bureaucratic shadow, too unimportant to count in many cases. But based on the records that do exist, from naval courts, pirate trials, port registries, and personal journals, historians estimate that a significant percentage of boys who went to sea before 12 never made it to adulthood. Some were killed in combat, some were killed by disease, some were killed by the sea itself, and some simply disappeared from the record, their fates unknown, their names forgotten. But some survived, and the ones who survived often became the hardest, most capable sailors of their generation. The sea was their school, and the curriculum was relentless. A cabin boy who lasted more than a year or two would begin to absorb skills that took other men decades to learn. He would read the wind by the feel of it on his face. He would gauge the ship's speed by watching the foam along the hull. He would learn knots, dozens of them, each for a specific purpose, and tie them in the dark with numb fingers on a rolling deck. If the navigator or the captain took an interest in him, he might learn celestial navigation, how to measure the angle of the sun above the horizon, how to consult charts and estimate latitude. A boy who possessed these skills became something more than cheap labor. He became an investment. Consider the case of a boy named John King, who in 1716, at the age of somewhere between 9 and 11, was aboard a merchant ship that was captured by the pirate Sam Bellamy. The story goes that when Bellamy offered the merchant crew the chance to join his pirate company, most of the adults refused. But young John King did not refuse. According to the accounts, he actually threatened to hurt himself if he was not allowed to join the pirates. He reportedly told his own mother, who was aboard the same ship, that he wanted to go, and Bellamy took him. John King became a member of the crew of the Whydah, one of the most famous pirate ships ever. He was given a pistol and a silk sash. And when the Whydah went down in a storm off Cape Cod in April of 1717, John King went down with her. His remains, including a small leg bone, were recovered from the wreck site centuries later. He was likely no more than 11 years old when he died. John King's story is one of the very few where we can attach a name and a face to the cabin boy experience. Most were anonymous. Most vanished into the vast, indifferent machinery of the age of sail without leaving a trace. They were the invisible labor force that kept these ships running. The smallest hands hauling the heaviest ropes, the youngest eyes watching for sails on the horizon, the most expendable members of a crew that was itself considered expendable by the society that produced it. There is a tendency, when we talk about pirates, to focus on the captains: Blackbeard, Calico Jack, Anne Bonny, Henry Morgan. These are the names that survived. These are the names we build movies and television shows around. But for every famous captain, there were dozens of unnamed boys crouching in the dark below decks, turning sandglasses in the dead of night, running gunpowder through smoke-filled corridors, eating weevil-infested biscuits in the dark, and wondering if they would ever see land again. The Golden Age of Piracy lasted roughly from the 1650s to the 1730s. During that span, thousands of ships sailed under the black flag across the Caribbean, the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and beyond. And aboard nearly every single one of them, there was a cabin boy, sometimes 2 or 3, children doing the work of men in conditions that would be considered criminal by any modern standard, for the promise of a share of treasure that might never come. There is a journal entry from a sailor named William Dampier, who circumnavigated the globe 3 times, in which he describes a cabin boy dying of fever on a ship anchored off the coast of what is now Vietnam. Dampier writes about it in the same flat tone he uses to describe the weather. The boy died. They wrapped him in canvas. They threw him overboard. They sailed on. That was the value placed on a cabin boy's life, not because these men were monsters, but because death at sea was so common that mourning became a luxury no one could afford. What eventually ended the cabin boy tradition was not a sudden burst of moral clarity. It was economics and military reform. As navies professionalized in the mid-1700s, they began establishing formal training programs for young sailors, midshipman schools, and naval academies that replaced the old system of simply throwing a child onto a ship and hoping he figured things out before he died. The merchant marine followed suit, gradually raising minimum ages and establishing apprenticeship systems with at least some degree of oversight. Piracy itself declined as colonial navies grew stronger, and the economic conditions that drove men to piracy began to shift. But the cabin boy did not disappear overnight. Well into the 1800s, boys as young as 10 were still going to sea on merchant vessels and naval ships. The conditions improved slowly, but the fundamental reality remained the same for generations. The sea needed small hands and cheap labor, and poor families needed one fewer mouth to feed. The transaction was simple, brutal, and repeated thousands of times across hundreds of years. When you look at a map of the Caribbean, at those blue waters between the islands, at the shipping lanes that once carried the wealth of empires, try to imagine it not as a postcard, but as a workplace. A workplace where the youngest employee was often younger than a modern fifth grader, where the hours were infinite, the food was rotten, the punishment was physical, and the retirement plan was either fortune or a burial at sea. That was the life of the cabin boy, not a character in a story, not a footnote in a history book. A child doing a man's job in a world that had no concept of childhood at all. The history of piracy is ultimately a history of desperation. Desperate men doing desperate things in desperate times. And at the very bottom of that desperation were the children. They did not choose the age they were born into. They did not choose the poverty that put them on a dock where a captain could grab them by the collar and drag them aboard. The sea chose them, and it consumed most of them without a second thought. And the next time someone tells you that pirate life was all freedom and adventure, remember John King, 11 years old, a pistol in his belt and a silk sash around his waist, going down with the Whydah into the freezing water off Cape Cod. Remember the unnamed boy dragged onto a sloop near Jamaica, handed a mop and a bucket, and told to start scrubbing. Remember the powder monkeys running through smoke, the rat catchers crawling through bilges, the small hands turning the sand glass every 30 minutes through the longest nights you can imagine. That was the real pirate life for the youngest person aboard. And nobody made a movie about that.